For those that have traveled just south of Night City's interior, you surely have noticed this. It's a giant mass of greenhouses set up by Biotechnica that presumably is growing a majority of plant life and food to keep Night City afloat. What you might not know is Biotechnica is also known for animal cloning and creating lots of meats that we see in the game as well. And even more interestingly, they also have dabbed a lot in human cloning. Their human clone trials have proved partially unsuccessful so far though, as the clone bodies have no consciousness and are really just merely lifeless husks of meat, sometimes being implanted with low-level AI to give them life. So here comes the scary part. You see, Biotechnica is by no means a company that is good. Back in the 2000s, they helped many other corpos with black market deals, and now in present day, it is heavily implied that a lot of the food being produced in these greenhouses is in fact human. Scanning meat bags in the Maelstrom gang hideout from the All Foods supplier, which gets its supply from the Biotechnica farms, you can see that 3.5% of the composition is unknown. What if that unknown material is actually human body parts? And we have more evidence too. Sector 4 of the Biotechnica flats, for example, is completely shut off and gated in, not allowing any players in. What could be so secret to be hiding in there? And on top of this, we also have multiple shards and gigs that lend credence to this theory as well. In the Biotechnica flats, for example, we can find a shard of an archived conversation between Tina Argon and Will Gunner, where they expand on details about black market proteins that no one really knows what is happening with them exactly. And also in the guinea pig gig, we learn about a Biotechnica executive who in her past experimented on many human beings that resulted in them dying, and more specifically, nomads. Now, if we come to the center of the Biotechnica flats, we can actually find a small nomad compound. And here we find a smoking gun, a massive gravesite with only a handful of NPCs left alive and rocking around, with many coming up to the graves and mourning throughout the day. In this town's small church, we can actually find a shard talking about how everything was fine, and then suddenly everyone started dying and disappearing. Using a little deductive reasoning, it isn't so far-fetched to assume Biotechnica may be up to something very dark here, kidnapping nomads that will not be traced back to anyone in the Badlands and using them for human cloning and meat production of human body parts that is eventually making its way into the Night City food supply. A damning proposition, for sure, if true. One of the biggest side plots in the Cyberpunk universe is about how many Night City residents are dealing with bouts of cyberpsychosis. Regina Jones even has an entire questline in the game dedicated to finding and dealing with these cyberpsychos, all in one effort to get more data on what is causing the outbursts. On the surface, it seems like it's simply individuals who have gone too far and augmented themselves to the point of madness, where they become more machine than man, and their body has extreme negative reaction to all the implants and drugs they're ingesting. But immediately off the bat, that makes us look to Maelstrom and wonder why so many of them lack cyberpsychosis. Some have gone insane for sure, but the vast majority we meet are just augmented bad guys that haven't completely lost their minds yet. If the theory about cyberpsychosis is correct, basically all of the guys in these gangs should be losing their minds. How are they able to and form a coherent gang? Remember the cyberpsycho that attacked the mayor of Night City and River's questline? So if you investigate further into the dead mayor, you find that the cause of death was a spiked BD. Well, if V actually puts that spiked BD on and watches it, the sequence shares many visual effects with the paralysis. And for those that don't know, we will touch on the paralysis more in the next section, but essentially they are being mind controlled remotely by shadow governments and people. This means that BD spikes causing cyberpsychosis are resulting in the same odd outcomes as people being mind controlled, meaning maybe all the cyberpsychosis is actually a lot more concerning. it might not be people going crazy with Chrome after all, but instead, people's augmented minds are being remotely taken over. In fact, in Judy's side job, talking about her revolution, Judy even remarks that her doll takeover chip that will enhance the dolls into fighters will make them feel like they are going through a cyberpsychosis episode. There are a lot of heavy implications throughout the Cyberpunk story that there is a lot more than meets the eye with cyberpsychosis, and that many of the people may actually be mind-controlled zombies, not just sad stories. Dotted all around Night City are many weird statues varying in size of a weird frog-like creature with 4 arms and a sword. On first glance, it's semi-amusing and maybe points to Buddhist temples or some sort of deity that some of the Night City residents worship. But if we go to one of the biggest statues in the Corpo Plaza, we see this code in big lettering right on the statue, FF06B5. For anyone that doesn't know, this is the hex color code for magenta, and in fact, we can even find a magenta version of this statue in Japantown and across Night City, and this time with legs and a Buddhist monk's figurine with robes on. Which is a very interesting coincidence, considering this frog-like creature very closely also resembles Hindu and Buddhist gods, with multiple arms and the sitting stance. Specifically, Mangala, the god of Mars. And as we know, in Cyberpunk, Mars is a big fight for contention. We also find monks meditating in front of these statues at times. And all in all, this implies that something is going on with these statues and religious undertones, and with Mars. And in fact, later on in this video, we'll tie it all together in our final tier. But even more damning, we actually see these statues around many important shadow characters in the game as well. That further implies there's some sort of broader connection between the statues and a grand conspiracy in Cyberpunk. A lot of people have probably gone through Panam's quest for reasons. And one part of the quest line actually takes you through a small underground cave in the Badlands. And it's a pretty cool section, especially because it's the only time in the game we really get to go in underground caves like this, barring the Pan-Am ending as well. What a lot of people don't know, though, is that in the game's files, and with modding and console commands, it's actually possible to find a pretty extensive network of unfinished and unpolished underground sections right beneath Night City. These sections are dark, damp, and devoid of any content, but they are there, and they certainly seem like they were intended for something at some point. In fact, during some of the radio station's commentaries throughout the game, there's one moment where we hear rumors of corrupted Corpo vampires living underground in extensive cave systems throughout Night City. This sounds absolutely absurd at first glance, but it gets extremely interesting when we look back to one of the earliest leaks of Cyberpunk 2077 by a previously disgruntled employee. The developer noted a lot of things about the game and its progress that at the time were hated in the community, but turned out to be true upon release. And most interestingly, he noted one big piece of cut content the game was originally intended to have was an underground network of sewers and caves that was home to an army of vampire-like creatures similar to the vampires in the Masquerade Bloodline series. When we put all this evidence together, it starts to become very clear that this network of unused tunnels for sure was originally intended to house something. And that something is most likely an army of Corpo vampires that kidnap and kill people to harness their strength. It's a pretty out there theory, but based on what we know about Cyberpunk and weird theories, it would fit right in. Maximum Mike and Gary the Prophet are the two most prolific conspiracy theorists in the game, and naturally, because of this, they have to make it onto my list. Mike is a man you always hear on the radio talking about crazy conspiracies and Corpo wrongdoings. And Gary is the Co-Carnage lookalike right outside Victor and Misty's clinics, shouting about aliens nonstop. But the crazy thing is, what if they weren't so crazy after all? Throughout his quest, Gary screams to the public, letting them know that giant humanoid lizard alien monster men are taking over the net and coming into our world to take control of everything. You see, although Gary's questline can end in multiple ways, the most interesting for sure is the final one where he is kidnapped and his disciple takes his place. When questioned, the disciple notes that Gary was kidnapped by men in suits with blue eyes and taken to the mothership. This gets even more weird as we can actually see men like this throughout the game, even donning a specific ring on their finger that seems to denote that they are part of some shadow organization. Maximum Mike also alludes to this on some of his radio chatter about interdimensional beings that have taken over the net and are hell-bent on controlling the world. So what originally sounds like crazy nonsense from a detained man on the streets and on the radio slowly unfolds into something much deeper. We know from some shards in the game that there has been probes sent into space with the explicit intention of having aliens connect to our net in the Cyberpunk universe. And even some speculation in these data banks that aliens may have already found us. Even more convincing, Bartmoss, who we talked about before, had a book that he made about himself. And in that book, he talked about how aliens were likely already a part of the net. And as one of the most genius hackers of all time, if you had to take someone's word for it, it would be his. But if Mike and Gary's sermons are actually true, this would mean that interdimensional lizard aliens are more than just funny Alex Jones-like theories, and actually a part of by far the biggest conspiracy in Cyberpunk 2077. One that will likely play out in future DLC and hopefully lends credence to the idea that there are things much scarier than corporations in cyberspace. But let's tie that all together in our last section.